10. A police inspector. Holmes seemed unnaturally calm after Margaret's frightening experience at the station. Mary Higgins had come to work in the kitchen. Mr. Hale did nothing except sit in his chair in a kind of waking dream. And Margaret decided not to tell him about the incident at the station, as things had ended well. Although it was possible that Leonards would borrow money to go to London, it was unlikely that he would find Frederick there. Margaret decided not to worry about something she could do nothing to prevent, as in a day or two Frederick would be safely out of England. Mr. Hale had wanted Mr. Bell to come to the funeral, but his old friend sent an affectionate letter saying that, unfortunately, he was unwell and could not come, although he promised to visit in September. Mr. Hale decided to invite Mr. Thornton instead, but Margaret, who feared the idea of seeing Mr. Thornton again, begged her father not to ask him, and in the end he agreed. The morning of the funeral arrived. Margaret had slept badly and was shocked to receive a letter from Frederick saying that Mr. Lennox was away and would not be back for another 2 days. Consequently, Frederick had decided to stay in London until his return. His decision made Margaret very anxious. If Leonards had gone to London, he now had more time to find Frederick. But she could not think about this for long. Her father was almost too weak to get into the funeral carriage, and he needed all Margaret's attention and support. When they arrived at the church for the funeral service, Margaret saw that Nicholas Higgins and Mary were there. She would have liked to talk to them, but felt unable to leave her father. Mr. Hale seemed to see nothing. He mechanically repeated the words of the clergyman, and at the end of the service he had to be led away as if he were blind. Dixon covered her face with her handkerchief and was so absorbed in her grief that she did not notice that people were leaving until someone spoke to her. It was Mr. Thornton. He had been standing at the back of the crowd with his head bent, and no one had recognized him. "I'm sorry, but can you tell me how Mr. Hale is? And Miss Hale, too?" "Of course, sir. Mr. Hale is very distressed. Miss Hale seems better than you would expect." Mr. Thornton would have preferred to hear that Margaret was really suffering. He was selfish enough to hope that his great love might be able to comfort her. But he was also disturbed by the memory of what he had seen at Outwood Station. She had been with such a handsome young man, and had seemed so relaxed and confident with him. What was she doing with a man at that late hour, so far away from home? All sorts of ideas went through his mind. Perhaps the reason why she was able to bear her grief was because of her love for this stranger. Mr. Thornton's face grew pale when he heard Dixon's answer, and he said coldly, "I suppose I may call, and see Mr. Hale, I mean." He spoke as if he did not care at all, but although he hated Margaret at times, he desperately wanted to see her. For some reason, Dixon never told Margaret about her meeting with Mr. Thornton, and so Margaret never learnt that he had attended her poor mother's funeral. Although to an observer Margaret did not seem to feel much grief, her pain was in reality so great that sometimes she wanted to scream. What made her and her father feel even worse was that 2 days had passed and there was still no letter from Frederick. Mr. Hale was walking up and down the sitting room, desperate with worry, when Dixon opened the door to announce Mr. Thornton. He took Mr. Hale's hands and held them for a minute or two, his face and eyes showing more sympathy than could be put into words. Then he turned to Margaret. She did not appear better than you would expect. There was a look of great suffering on her face, and her eyes were red from crying. He had intended to greet her coldly, but he could not help going to her and speaking about her mother's death so gently that Margaret could not hide her emotion. She picked up her sewing and sat down. Mr. Thornton's heart beat fast, and for the moment he completely forgot about Outwood Station. Just then Dixon came in and said, "Miss Hale, there is someone to see you." She looked so upset that Margaret immediately thought that something had happened to Frederick. Feeling sick, she followed Dixon out of the room. "It's a police inspector. He's in the study." "Did he name—" "No, he just asked if he could speak to you." "Make sure father does not come down." The inspector was a little surprised by Margaret's haughty manner as she entered the study. She showed neither surprise nor curiosity, but stood waiting for him to speak.
"I'm sorry, madam, but I need to ask you a few questions. A man called Leonards has died at the hospital. He had an accident, a fall, at Outwood Station, between 5 and 6 last Thursday evening. The fall was not serious, but because of a previous illness and the man's alcohol habit, it killed him."
Margaret's large eyes opened a little, but otherwise she showed no emotion at all. She said, "Well, go on."
"There will have to be an inquest," said the inspector.
He explained that a porter at the station had seen Leonards rudely push a young lady who was on the platform. She was with a companion who had then pushed Leonards off the edge of the platform. The porter said that he had not thought any more about the matter, because the platform was not high and he had seen Leonards get up and run down the platform.
"A grocer's assistant who was on the platform thinks that the woman may have been you, madam," said the inspector, watching Margaret carefully.
"I was not there," said Margaret expressionlessly. The inspector bowed, but did not speak. The grocer's assistant had not been sure that it was her, and he thought that she was probably telling the truth.
"Then, madam, you can assure me that you were not the companion of the gentleman who pushed Leonards off the platform?"
"I was not there," said Margaret, slowly and heavily. Margaret's exact repetition of her words made the inspector suspicious. Frowning, he said,
"I may have to call on you again this evening and ask you to appear at the inquest. You may need to give an alibi."
When Margaret's haughty expression did not change, the inspector decided that the grocer's assistant was probably wrong.
"It is unlikely, madam, that this will happen. I hope you will forgive me for doing my duty."
Margaret bowed her head as the inspector walked towards the door. She opened it for him and accompanied him to the front door. Then she returned to the study, locked the door, and fainted. Mr. Thornton and Mr. Hale talked for some time. Margaret's father found Mr. Thornton wonderfully kind and comforting, and trusted him enough to tell him his most secret feelings. At the end of their conversation, both men felt much closer to each other. Mr. Thornton left the house and was walking along the street when he met the police inspector, who was called Watson. They knew one another, and Mr. Thornton had helped Watson get his first job. They greeted each other in a friendly way, and the police inspector said, "I believe you were the magistrate who went to the hospital last night to hear the statement of a man called Leonards. He died several hours later." "Yes, I'm afraid he was a drunken fellow," said Mr. Thornton. "Well, sir, his death is connected with somebody in the house I saw you coming out of just now. Mr. Hale's house, I believe." "Yes," said Mr. Thornton, looking at the inspector with sudden interest. "What about it?" "There is some evidence that Miss Hale was the companion of the gentleman who pushed Leonards off the platform. A grocer's assistant who was there said that he recognised her, but the young lady denies that she was there at the time." "Miss Hale denies she was there?" said Mr. Thornton. "Yes, she denied it twice. Since you are the magistrate who saw Leonards, it seems a good idea to ask for your advice." "She denies having been at the station," said Mr. Thornton in a low tone. He paused and then said, "You are quite right to ask for my advice. Don't do anything until you have seen me again. It's now 3 o'clock. Come to my factory at 4. "I will, sir," said Watson. The two men separated, and Mr. Thornton hurried to the factory, went to his office, and locked the door. There he thought about every detail of his last 2 meetings with Margaret. She had looked so full of grief when he had seen her an hour ago that he had forgotten his suspicions. Now they were awakened again. Perhaps she was not as pure as she seemed. The thought came and then went immediately. But she had lied to the inspector when she was usually so truthful. What did she fear would be revealed if she told the truth? Mr. Thornton almost pitied her for the shame she must have felt to lie in this way. Suddenly he jumped up. As a magistrate, he could prevent the inquest. Then Margaret would not have to give an alibi. Even if she was in love with another man, he could still save her from being shamed in public. He might despise her for lying, but he could still protect her. He left his office and went out for about half an hour. When he returned, he wrote 2 lines on a piece of paper, which he put in an envelope. He instructed a clerk to give the note to Mr. Watson when he came at 4 o'clock. The note contained these words: "There will be no inquest, as the medical evidence shows that there is no reason for one. Do not investigate further. The decision is my responsibility." "Well," thought Watson, "that means I don't have to do a difficult job. None of my witnesses seem certain of anything except the young woman." That evening, Watson visited the Hales' house again. Margaret had had a terrible day. She had decided to say nothing to either Dixon or her father about her meeting with the inspector, but lay on the sofa looking ill, only speaking when spoken to. She tried to smile when her father looked anxiously at her, but only succeeded in sighing. At 9 o'clock, the inspector had still not come, and Mr. Hale said good night and went to bed. Margaret was preparing to do the same when the doorbell rang. She answered the door herself and led the inspector into the study. "You are late," she said, hardly daring to breathe. Well?
I'm sorry to have given you unnecessary trouble, madam. They've decided not to have the inquest.
So there will be no more inquiries, said Margaret.
I believe I've got Mr. Thornton's note with me, said the inspector.
Mr. Thornton's? Said Margaret.
Yes, he's a magistrate. Ah, here it is.
Margaret took it, but felt so confused that she could not understand what was written on the note. She held it in her hand and pretended to read it.
I met Mr. Thornton this morning, just as he was coming out of this house, the inspector continued. He's an old friend of mine, and he's also the magistrate who saw Leonards last night, so I explained my problem to him.
Margaret sighed deeply. She was afraid of what she might hear and wished the man would go. She forced herself to speak. Thank you for calling. It is very late. He held out his hand for the note, and she gave it back to him, then said, The writing is small, and I could not read it. Could you read it to me? He read it aloud to her. You told Mr. Thornton I was not there.
Oh, of course, madam. I'm sorry to have troubled you. The young man seemed so sure at first, and now he says he was never sure at all. Good night, madam.
She rang the bell, and Dixon came to show the inspector out. As the servant returned up the passage, Margaret passed her. It is all right, she said, without looking at her, and before Dixon could say anything, she ran upstairs to her bedroom and locked the door. Then she threw herself on her bed, feeling much too exhausted to do anything but lie motionless. After half an hour, she felt a little better and sat up. Her first feeling was one of huge relief. There would be no inquest, and so there was no danger that Frederick would be identified as her companion at the station. She then started to try and remember every word that the inspector had said about Mr. Thornton. When had the inspector seen him? What had Mr. Thornton said? What had he done? What were the exact words of his note? Until she could remember every word in the note, her mind refused to go further. But the facts were clear enough. Mr. Thornton had seen her close to Outwood Station last Thursday night, and had been told that she had denied being there. Margaret did not tell herself that there was a good excuse for her lies, nor did she imagine that Mr. Thornton would be suspicious of the fact that she was with a handsome young man. There was only one thing that concerned her. The fact was that Mr. Thornton now saw her as a liar. She was a liar, and he knew it, and must despise her for it. "Oh, Frederick," Margaret cried, "what a price I have paid for saving you!" She fell asleep with these thoughts going round and round in her mind. When she woke the next morning and the full memory of the situation returned to her, another thought came to her. It was because Mr. Thornton had learnt about her denial that he had decided there would be no inquest. He had done this so that she would not have to give an alibi at the inquest. But if this were true, Margaret did not feel at all grateful, as it meant that he realised that she had done something very wrong. In that case, Margaret thought that he must feel great contempt for her. She hated the thought that he had saved her and wondered what Leonards had told him. Perhaps he had told Mr. Thornton about Frederick, or perhaps Mr. Thornton had heard the story from Mr. Bell. If so, then the mill owner had lied to save Mr. Hale's son, who had come to see his dying mother. In that case, then she should be grateful to him. But she feared that he did not know the real facts, and only saw her as a liar who must be saved. Margaret had always seen herself as superior to Mr. Thornton. She was in a different position now, and felt very unhappy about it. She did not ask herself why it mattered so much to her that Mr. Thornton should despise her. Dixon knocked at the door and came in. "Here's something that will make you feel better. A letter from your brother." Margaret thanked Dixon, but waited until she was alone before she opened the letter. The first thing that she noticed was that the letter had been sent 2 days ago. It should have arrived the day before. Frederick wrote that he had seen Mr. Lennox, who had said that it was very dangerous indeed for him to have returned to England. But after some discussion, the lawyer had also agreed that it would be worthwhile finding witnesses who could tell the real story of what happened on the Russell. Then perhaps the trial could take place, and the court would decide that Frederick was innocent. "It seemed to me, little sister," wrote Frederick, "that your letter made him very anxious to help me. He's an intelligent fellow. I am on a boat that will leave in 5 minutes. What an escape that was! Don't tell anyone I came to England, not even the Shaws." Margaret could not have been more thankful that Frederick was safe. But the date on the letter told her that he had left England 30 hours ago. There had been no need for her to lie to the inspector and make Mr. Thornton despise her. But why did she keep thinking about Mr. Thornton? Why did she care so much about his opinion of her? What were these strong feelings that made her tremble and hide her face in the pillow? She dressed and took the letter to her father, who she knew would not pay any attention to Frederick's words about the incident at the station. Mr. Hale was very relieved that his son was safe, but was concerned about Margaret, who seemed very distressed. "Poor child, poor child," he said, and made her lie down on the sofa and cover herself with a shawl. Through the day he tried hard to be cheerful, and Margaret was grateful to him. Mr. Thornton had said that he might call that evening with a book for Mr. Hale, but Margaret knew he would not come, since he would be afraid of meeting her so soon after what had happened. She realized now that it was wrong of her to feel ungrateful. Oh, but she was grateful. It was a pleasure to her to realize how much she respected him. The book from Mr. Thornton arrived that evening with a kind note inside. But as Margaret had guessed, he did not come himself. By now she felt very confused. She felt great shame when she thought about meeting him again, but at the same time she very much wanted to see him. But Mr. Thornton did not come the next day, nor the day after that. This surprised and upset Mr. Hale, as Mr. Thornton had promised that he would call. Every time that the doorbell rang, both father and daughter hoped that it was the mill owner, but he did not come. Chapter 11. A Woman in Love. What most upset Mr. Thornton about Margaret's lie was that it concerned an attractive young man. He could not forget that Margaret had looked at this man as if she loved him. And then there was the fact that she had been with him in the evening when it was growing dark, at some distance from home. The fact that she had lied showed that she had done something wrong and needed to hide it. Mr. Thornton decided that Margaret, who was usually so truthful, was prepared to do something wrong because of her love for this stranger. This thought made him fiercely jealous and very bad-tempered. At home he was more than usually silent, and annoyed his mother by walking up and down the sitting room without speaking. "Can you stop? Can you sit down for a moment?" said his mother crossly one evening. "I have something to tell you." He sat down, and Mrs. Thornton continued. "Betsy is so upset by her lover's death that she cannot work for us any more, and is going to leave us." "Her lover was Leonard's, you told me." "Yes, and she has told me that Miss Hale was with the young man who pushed Leonard's off the platform. She was walking in a field with him, apparently, quite late in the evening." "I don't see why that should concern us." "I am glad to hear you say so," said Mrs. Thornton, looking pleased. "But I made a promise to her mother that if her daughter did something wrong, I would speak to her about it." "I don't see any harm in what she did that evening," said Mr. Thornton, getting up and turning his face away. "You would not have approved if Fanny had done it." "Miss Hale and Fanny are very different. Miss Hale always has a good reason for doing something, unlike Fanny." "How kind you are about your sister. Miss Hale's behaviour is clear to me now. The man she was with is her lover." Mr. Thornton turned round to look at his mother, his face very grey, and said, "Yes, mother, I do believe he is her lover." The pain of admitting this was almost too much to bear, and he turned away from her, then immediately turned round again and said, "Mother, he is her lover, but she may need help and advice. I know that something is wrong. She is in difficulty. Go to her and advise her." "What do you mean, John?" said his mother, really shocked. "What do you know?" He did not answer, and after some moments she said, "I will go to her and speak to her as if she were Fanny and had gone walking with a young man in the evening. Then I shall have kept my promise to her mother and done my duty." "You cannot talk to her in that way. She is much too proud." "I can, and I will." "Well," Mr. Thornton said, going to the door, "don't tell me any more about it. I can't bear to think about it." "Oh, Margaret, could you not have loved me?" he said fiercely to himself as he locked himself in his office. "I may not be a gentleman, but I would never have made you lie for me." Margaret was sitting alone, writing a letter to Edith, when Dixon opened the door to announce Mrs. Thornton. Margaret was so gentle and polite that Mrs. Thornton found it very difficult to say her carefully prepared words. It was only as she stood up to leave that she coughed and said, "Miss Hale, I promised your mother that if you behaved badly in any way, I would do my duty and give you my opinion of your behaviour." Margaret blushed. She thought that Mrs. Thornton was going to speak to her about the lie she had told, and that Mr. Thornton had asked her to do this. Mrs. Thornton continued. "At first, when I heard that you had been seen walking with a gentleman in the evening as far away from home as Outwood Station, I could hardly believe it. But my son confirmed the story. It was not at all wise of you, Miss Hale. The story could harm your reputation." Margaret's eyes flashed fire. So Mrs. Thornton had not come to talk to her about the fact that she had lied. Instead, Mrs. Thornton wanted to discuss her behaviour when she hardly knew her at all. It was too rude. Seeing how angry Margaret was, Mrs. Thornton became angry too. "For your mother's sake, I felt it was my duty to talk to you about your behaviour." "For my mother's sake!" exclaimed Margaret tearfully. "She never wished you to insult me, I am sure." "Insult you, Miss Hale?" "Yes, madam," said Margaret more steadily. "What do you know about me that would make you suspect—" "Oh!" she said, covering her face with her hands. "I know now. Mr. Thornton has told you." "No, Miss Hale," said Mrs. Thornton. "Mr. Thornton has told me nothing. Listen, young lady, and you will understand what kind of man you have refused. This Milton manufacturer, whom you despise so much, told me that he believed that you were in difficulties because of a gentleman, and that you needed some advice. He admitted that you had been seen with a gentleman at Outwood Station, but apart from that, he has said nothing." Margaret was still crying, with her face hidden in her hands, and Mrs. Thornton softened and said, "Perhaps there are circumstances that can explain your behaviour." Margaret considered what to say, but could not find a good explanation. Finally, she said in a low voice, "I can give you no explanation. I have done wrong, but not in the way you think. I think Mr. Thornton judges me more kindly than you." "It is the last time I shall try to give you advice," said Mrs. Thornton stiffly. "I only came because your mother asked me to. I never liked the fact that my son cared for you. You did not appear to be good enough for him. But your behaviour during the riot showed that you cared for him too. When the servants and workers started talking about you, I felt that it was right for him to ask you to marry him. But when he came to see you, your feelings had changed. I told him that I thought that perhaps your lover—" "What must you think of me, madam?" said Margaret, throwing back her head haughtily. "Please do not continue. I will not try to explain my actions. You must allow me to leave." And she left the room with the noiseless grace of a princess. Mrs. Thornton was not particularly annoyed by Margaret's behaviour. She did not care enough about her for that. The fact that her words had upset Margaret pleased her, as it showed that Margaret cared about what people thought of her. "I like to see a girl get angry at the idea of being talked about," thought Mrs. Thornton. "It shows that she has the right kind of pride." After she had left Mrs. Thornton, Margaret went to her room and made herself recall every word they had spoken. Then she said sadly to herself, Her words can't really affect me because I was not with a lover. I was with Frederick. But it's awful knowing that she thinks this about me. She doesn't know my real sin, that I lied. He never told her. I should have known he would not. Then a new thought came to her. He too must think poor Frederick is my lover. I understand now. It's bad enough that he knows that I lied, but he also believes that someone else cares for me and that Oh dear, why do I care about what he thinks? I don't know why, but I am very miserable. He misunderstands me so completely and I feel terrible. She jumped up. No, I will not examine my own feelings. It would be useless. If I live to be an old woman, perhaps I'll sit by the fire and think about the life I might have had. There must be many women who have made the same mistake and only realize when it's too late. I was so rude to him that day, but I did not understand my feelings then. I don't even know when they began. I must be strong. It will be difficult, but when I see him, I will be very calm and quiet. But I may not see him. He has not called for some days. That would be worst of all. To try and forget about her feelings, Margaret decided to visit the Higgins' next-door neighbours, the Bouchers. But when she arrived at their house, a neighbour told her that Mrs. Boucher was dying. A doctor had been called, and the children were being looked after by neighbours. Margaret decided that the best thing she could do was call on the Higgins. She went next door and found Nicholas Higgins playing with the 3 youngest Boucher children. "Have you seen Mr. Thornton?" she asked Nicholas.
Yes,
said Nicholas angrily. "He refused you," said Margaret sorrowfully.
of course he did. I knew he would.
"I am sorry I asked you. You told him I sent you?"
I don't know if I mentioned your name. I said a woman had advised me to ask him.
"I am disappointed in Mr. Thornton," said Margaret. There was a slight noise behind her. Margaret turned round and saw Mr. Thornton standing at the door, with a look of angry surprise on his face. In one quick movement, Margaret stood up and left without saying a word. As she hurried to Mrs. Boucher's, she heard the door shut loudly behind her. Mr. Thornton had come to see Higgins because, although he tried to hide it, there was a part of him that was very soft. He had refused Higgins because he had heard reports that the man was a troublemaker. But afterwards he had learnt that Higgins had waited 5 hours to see him, and he was impressed by the man's patience. He had also learnt that the worker's story about the Boucher family was true. He had come to Higgins's house to offer him work. Higgins was a proud man. There was a long pause before he accepted the offer, but he did, and the 2 men shook hands. "Was that the woman who advised you to ask me for work?" asked Mr. Thornton. Higgins told him that it was. Mr. Thornton frowned, disliking the idea that Margaret might think he had given Higgins work because of her, when he was only doing what was right. As Mr. Thornton left, Margaret came out of the Boucher's house. She did not see him, and he followed her, admiring her tall, graceful figure. Then he suddenly felt very jealous. He wanted to speak to her and see how she would behave after all that had happened. Also, he had heard her last words, and wanted her to know that he had given Higgins work. He came up to her, and she looked at him in surprise. "You do not need to be disappointed in me, Miss Hale. I have given Higgins work." "I am glad," said Margaret coldly. There was a silence, and then Mr. Thornton said, "Miss Hale, have you no explanation for the lie that you told? You must know what it has made me think." Margaret said nothing. She was wondering whether she could give some kind of an explanation and still be loyal to Frederick. "No," said Mr. Thornton. "I will ask no more questions. Believe me, your secret is safe with me. But please be careful. I am now only speaking as a friend of your father." "I am aware of that," said Margaret, forcing herself to appear uninterested. "But the secret is about another person, and I cannot explain it without harming him." "I have no desire to know the gentleman's secrets," said Mr. Thornton angrily. "My only interest in you is as a friend. That is all now. You believe me, Miss Hale?" "Yes," said Margaret, quietly and sadly. "Then really, I don't see why we should continue walking together. I thought perhaps that you might have something to say, but I see that we mean nothing to each other. If you are quite certain that I no longer have any strong feelings for you, then I wish you good afternoon." And he walked away. "What can he mean?" wondered Margaret. "He talks as if I thought he still cared about me, when I know he cannot. His mother will have said all those cruel things about me, but I will try my best not to care about him. Surely I can control this wild, miserable feeling that tempted me to betray Frederick, just so that he would respect me again. I must be strong. I must." Several months passed, and although Mr. Thornton occasionally came for lessons with Mr. Hale, he never asked to see Margaret. After her conversation in the street with Mr. Thornton, Margaret's moods varied strangely. But a letter from Edith made her feel a little less miserable, as her cousin talked about returning to Harley Street in about 6 months and inviting her to stay. Life became quiet and boring. Margaret looked after the house and her father, visited Mary Higgins, and helped to care for the Boucher children after the death of their mother. Then, in September, as he had promised, Mr. Bell came to visit. Mr. Hale's old friend liked Margaret enormously, and they immediately became very good friends. "I must say, I think your opinions are very old-fashioned," said Margaret jokingly to Mr. Bell one afternoon. "Listen to this daughter of yours, Hale. What has life in Milton done to her? She has become a Democrat." "You say that just because I believe that commerce is good for the country." "I don't like this rushing around, with everybody trying to get rich. I don't believe there's a man in Milton who knows how to sit still." "That reminds me, Mr. Thornton is coming to tea tonight," said Mr. Bell, not noticing that Margaret became very quiet. Mr. Thornton was still in love with Margaret, despite all his efforts not to be. He had tried hard not to see her, but in his dreams she came dancing towards him with open arms. He came late to the Hales' house, and, to avoid meeting her, spent a long time talking about business matters with Mr. Bell. He was bad-tempered and cross, and Mr. Bell thought he had become quite a rude fellow. At last they went upstairs and found Margaret holding a letter, which she was eagerly discussing with her father.
"It is a letter from Henry Lennox," said Mr. Hale to Mr. Bell. "It makes Margaret very hopeful."
Mr. Bell nodded. Mr. Thornton looked at Margaret, who blushed, and he wanted to leave and never return again. A conversation began about the differences between Oxford University, where Mr. Bell taught, and Milton, where he had lived as a child. Mr. Bell talked about the importance of tradition, history and learning, while Mr. Thornton felt that action and living in the present mattered more. Mr. Bell joked a lot, and Margaret saw that this upset Mr. Thornton, who wanted a serious conversation. Trying to change the subject, she said, "Edith says that cotton materials in Corfu are cheaper and better than those in London." "Are you sure?" said her father. "I think Edith is exaggerating." "If Margaret is sure, then I am too," said Mr. Bell. "Margaret, you are such a truthful person. I don't believe that anyone who is a relation of yours could exaggerate." "Is Miss Hale so well known for truthfulness?" said Mr. Thornton bitterly. The moment he said this, he could have bitten his tongue out. Why was he so evil tonight? And why was he so cross with Mr. Bell, his kind old friend? Margaret did not get up and leave, as she would have done formerly. She glanced at Mr. Thornton in sad surprise, with the expression of a hurt child, then bent over her sewing and did not speak again. Mr. Thornton could not help looking at her, and he saw that when she sighed, her whole body trembled. He desperately wanted her to look at him and speak to him, so that he could show her he was sorry, but she did not raise her head. She could not care for him, he thought. He gave short, sharp answers to the older men's questions, and left rather suddenly. As he walked home, he thought that he was right to see Margaret as little as possible. Her power over him was too great. When the mill owner left, Margaret silently began to fold up her work, looking completely exhausted. As the three prepared for bed, Mr. Bell said, "Success has spoiled that man. He used to be a simple, honest fellow. Now everything offends him." "He was not his usual self tonight," Margaret said quickly. "Something must have happened to upset him." Mr. Bell looked at her sharply. After she had left the room, he said, "Hale, have you ever thought that Thornton and your daughter might be fond of each other?" "Never," said Mr. Hale, astonished by the idea. "I am sure you are wrong. If there is anything, it is all on Mr. Thornton's side." "I would say that she showed quite a few signs tonight." "I am sure you are wrong," said Mr. Hale. "Margaret has been almost rude to Mr. Thornton at times." "Well, it was only a suggestion, and whether I'm right or wrong, I'm very sleepy." Mr. Bell left the next day, telling Margaret that she must come to him if she was in difficulty. To Mr. Hale he said, "That Margaret of yours has gone deep into my heart. Take care of her. She is a very precious creature. I wish you'd leave Milton, Hale. It is completely unsuitable for you, and I'm sorry I recommended it. You and Margaret could come and live with me. I would like that very much. What do you think?" "Never," said Mr. Hale. "My one great change has been made, and it has caused me great suffering.
I will live here and I will be buried here.
Well, we will forget it for the moment. Margaret, give me a goodbye kiss. Remember, I am always here for you.